The world as we knew it is changing. Not gradually, not predictably, but with a speed and volatility that's catching even the most prepared nations off guard. And if there's one country that has built its entire identity on preparation, on precision, on reading the global winds before they shift, it's Singapore. This tiny island nation, barely visible on most world maps, has transformed itself into one of the planet's most interconnected economies. It's a place where East meets West, where global supply chains converge, where billions of dollars flow through its ports and financial institutions every single day. Singapore doesn't just participate in globalization, in many ways it embodies it. But what happens when the very foundation of that global system begins to crack? When the rules that governed international trade for decades suddenly no longer apply? When the superpower that underwrote global stability for generations decides it's no longer interested in playing that role? These are the questions keeping world leaders awake at night. And perhaps no one is thinking more deeply about these questions than Singapore's Prime Minister, a man tasked with steering his nation through what he calls the most consequential transition in modern history. In a rare and extensive conversation, the Prime Minister sat down to discuss the seismic shifts reshaping our world. From America's retreat, from global leadership to China's meteoric rise, from the weaponization of trade to the emergence of new alliances that could reshape the 21st century. This is the story of how one small nation is trying to survive, and perhaps even thrive, in a world that's becoming more dangerous, more unpredictable, and more fragmented by the day. Singapore has always thrived on certainty. It's a nation that values order, that plans decades ahead, that builds systems designed to withstand any shock. Stability isn't just a preference in Singapore, it's a necessity. For a country with no natural resources, surrounded by much larger neighbors, predictability has been the bedrock of survival. But that bedrock is crumbling. We're living through a fundamental transformation, the Prime Minister explains, his tone measured but unmistakably concerned. We're witnessing the transition from a unipolar world, one dominated by American power and leadership, to something completely different. A multipolar landscape where no single nation holds all the cards. This isn't just political theory, it's the lived reality of nations across the globe, particularly those like Singapore that have built their prosperity on the foundations of American-led globalization. For 75 years, the United States acted as what economists call the global public goods provider. It maintained open sea lanes, guaranteed freedom of navigation, underwrote a rules-based trading system, and provided security guarantees that allowed smaller nations to prosper without having to militarize to the teeth. This American-led order wasn't perfect, far from it, but it created an environment where international trade could flourish and where small nations could punch above their weight. Now that's changing. America is pulling back, questioning whether it wants to continue bearing the costs of global leadership. And into that vacuum, uncertainty, chaos. A world where the old playbook no longer works, but the new one hasn't been written yet. We find ourselves in this deeply uncomfortable space, the Prime Minister continues, where the established norms we relied upon are dissolving, but we haven't yet figured out what replaces them. We're navigating without a map. The question becomes, in this environment, how does a small, trade-dependent nation survive? The easy answer would be to wait, to hope that somehow things will settle down, that America will rediscover its appetite for global leadership, that tensions will ease, that the world will return to something resembling the stability of the past few decades. But Singapore isn't built on hope, it's built on action. We cannot afford passivity, the Prime Minister states emphatically. Hoping for a return to normalcy is a luxury we simply don't have. We must act now, even if the path forward isn't entirely clear. This means investing in new partnerships, building alternative trade routes, strengthening regional institutions, and working with what he calls like-minded countries. Nations that still believe in rules-based trade, in multilateral cooperation, in keeping the channels of global commerce open even as larger powers turn inward. Singapore is actively pursuing trade agreements beyond traditional partners. It's deepening ties within Southeast Asia through ASEAN. It's looking to Europe as a potential counterweight to the US-China rivalry. It's even pioneering new frameworks for trade that could eventually be adopted globally. But all of this raises a fundamental question. Can you build a new global order without the world's largest economy? The United States may not be ready or willing to participate in these initiatives right now, the Prime Minister acknowledges. But we cannot let that paralyze us. We move forward with those who are willing, and we leave the door open for America to rejoin when it's ready. There's a calculated optimism in this approach, but also a recognition of harsh realities. The world Singapore is preparing for maybe one where America remains partially disengaged for years, perhaps decades. This brings us to one of the most debated questions in international relations today. Is the current American administration's approach to the world a temporary aberration, or does it represent something deeper? There are two schools of thought. The first argues that what we're witnessing is personality-driven, a product of one particular leader's worldview that will fade when that leader leaves office. The second sees this as symptomatic of deeper, structural changes in American society and politics. Singapore's Prime Minister falls squarely into the second camp. What's happening in America right now isn't merely about one administration or one individual, he explains. It reflects profound transformations in American political culture and society itself. There's a widespread feeling among Americans that they haven't benefited from the global system they created, that they've been carrying a disproportionate burden while others have free-rided on their efforts. This sentiment, that America has been taken advantage of, that it's time to put American interests first, isn't confined to one political party or one segment of society. It runs deeper than that, and that means even after this administration ends, whoever comes next will likely be far more skeptical of international commitments than their predecessors were. But here's where the Prime Minister shows his diplomatic skill. Rather than dismissing these concerns outright, he acknowledges there may be some validity to them. Have there been free riders in the global system? Probably. Should countries take more responsibility for their own security and prosperity rather than relying entirely on American guarantees? Absolutely. In that sense, what this American administration has done is force a long overdue reckoning. You can see this playing out across Europe, where defense spending is climbing after decades of underfunding. You can see it in Asia, where nations are bolstering their own military capabilities. The world is indeed taking more responsibility for itself. But, and this is crucial, there's a price to pay for this awakening. While countries assuming greater responsibility is positive, the method by which this is happening risks severely damaging the very frameworks that have maintained global stability, the Prime Minister warns. We're concerned about the collateral damage. In a multipolar world, there's a very real danger that we don't just get multiple power centers, we get exclusive spheres of influence. Imagine, for a moment, a world carved up into blocks. An American-led hemisphere, a Chinese-dominated Asia, a European zone, each with its own rules, its own standards, its own trade barriers. For a small, hyper-connected nation like Singapore, this would be honestly catastrophic. The Prime Minister warns, if we end up in a world of exclusionary blocks and rigidly defined spheres of influence, it becomes infinitely more dangerous and unstable. He continues, for us, multipolarity shouldn't mean isolation and division. It should mean multiple centers of power that still find ways to connect and cooperate. This is why Singapore is so invested in ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. It's why they're constantly working to strengthen regional frameworks that allow smaller nations to engage with all major powers without having to choose sides. As he explains, we envision Southeast Asia as a platform, neutral ground where American, Chinese, European, Indian, and other interests can coexist and interact. We want to be a bridge, not a battleground. But then the question arises, can ASEAN really become that bridge? ASEAN is often criticized as a talk shop, an organization heavy on dialogue but light on action. Just think about it. 10 nations with vastly different political systems, economic models, religious traditions, and ethnic compositions trying to act in concert. It's really not easy, but the Prime Minister pushes back against this characterization. He says, people often belittle ASEAN's achievements, but they shouldn't. Consider what Southeast Asia looked like 70 years ago. This region was called the Balkans of Asia, fractured, unstable, prone to conflict. And yet, since the end of the Vietnam War, we've maintained relative peace. No major wars between member states. That's not nothing. That's actually quite remarkable. He's right. In a region that encompasses communist one-party states, constitutional monarchies, military-influenced democracies, and everything in between, the fact that they've avoided major conflict is honestly pretty noteworthy. But now there's pressure to take ASEAN to the next level, to transform it from a diplomatic forum into a genuine economic bloc that can negotiate as one with larger powers. The Prime Minister reveals there are concrete plans to accelerate ASEAN integration, to create a more competitive, more attractive single market. And ironically, American tariffs have actually accelerated this process. They've given ASEAN leaders a sense of urgency. Nothing motivates cooperation, it seems, like a common external challenge. When the United States announced sweeping tariffs on trading partners, the global economy braced for impact. Singapore, as one of the world's most open economies, seemed particularly vulnerable. But, interestingly, Singapore got off relatively lightly, a baseline tariff of 10%. Why? Well, because unlike many of its neighbors, Singapore doesn't run a trade surplus with the United States in goods. In fact, America invests more in Singapore than it imports from it. Still, for a nation accustomed to zero tariffs, 10% feels seismic. The Prime Minister observes with a wry smile. It's fascinating how our frame of reference has shifted so quickly. We now think of 10 or 20% tariffs as relief. We started from zero. From our perspective, the correct figure is still zero, but 10% has become the new normal. What can you do? There's a kind of resignation in that statement, but also a sense of pragmatism. This is the world Singapore now operates in. But the tariff story isn't over. Semiconductors and pharmaceuticals, two sectors where Singapore is deeply embedded in global supply chains, face potential additional tariffs. Negotiations are still ongoing. Interestingly, some American pharmaceutical companies with operations in Singapore have already secured individual exemptions by committing to invest back in the United States. This reveals something important about how the current system works. It's transactional, company by company, deal by deal. Not the rules-based system Singapore prefers, but one they're learning to navigate. Supply chain warfare, the new battlefield. Beyond tariffs, there's another dimension to this economic conflict: supply chains. Specifically, the pressure on countries like Singapore to ensure that advanced technology, particularly semiconductors, doesn't flow from the United States and its allies to China. This puts Singapore in an impossibly delicate position. Our stance is crystal clear, the Prime Minister states firmly. Singapore has built itself as a business hub based on reputation, on rule of law, on trust, on integrity. We will not tolerate businesses violating our laws or using Singapore as a platform to circumvent other countries' export controls. Singapore has established robust mechanisms, allowing American authorities to investigate companies operating in Singapore that might be evading United States export controls. They're walking a tightrope, maintaining good relations with Washington while not being seen as merely an extension of American enforcement. We're prepared to extend similar arrangements to other countries, he adds. This isn't just about America. Export controls are becoming a broader phenomenon. Indeed they are. China has its own export controls on rare earth elements. Europe is developing its own framework. Welcome to the world of economic warfare through supply chain choke points. The great decoupling. That isn't, at least not yet. For all the talk of decoupling between the world's two largest economies, the reality is far more complicated. Trade flows continue. Supply chains, while being reconfigured, haven't collapsed. The predicted economic catastrophe hasn't materialized. At least not yet. Several factors have cushioned the blow, the Prime Minister explains. First, the actual tariffs implemented haven't been as severe as initially threatened. Second, there's been massive front-loading, companies rushing to complete transactions before tariffs hit. Third, new technologies, particularly artificial intelligence, have kept economic growth surprisingly resilient. But he's quick to add that Singapore, as an incredibly open economy, serves as an early warning system. We call ourselves the canary in the coal mine, he says. Because we're so exposed to global trade flows, we feel changes in the economic environment before others do. And what is Singapore feeling now? We didn't feel much impact in the first half of this year. But as we move into the second half, we're starting to see slowdown. Businesses are hesitating on new investments. Hiring is being delayed. There's a general pulling back driven by uncertainty. This uncertainty, this wait-and-see approach by businesses, may prove more economically damaging than the tariffs themselves. The U.S.-China fault line, dancing on a volcano. At the heart of all this turbulence lies one relationship, the United States and China. It is, as the Prime Minister puts it, the most consequential relationship in the world, and also the most dangerous fault line in international relations. Right now, both giants seem intent on insulating themselves from each other, reducing dependencies, identifying choke points they can use as leverage, building redundant supply chains. But here's the problem. Every action provokes a reaction. When one economy squeezes, the other immediately squeezes back, the Prime Minister observes. You end up in a dynamic of mutually assured economic destruction. When America restricts chip sales to China, China accelerates its own semiconductor industry development and restricts rare earth exports. When China tightens rare earth supplies, America and its allies scramble to find alternative sources and discover that rare earths aren't actually that rare if you're willing to mine them. The economist in me says we should never underestimate supply elasticity, the Prime Minister notes. When you restrict supply of something, alternatives emerge. It takes time, but it happens. This dynamic could, paradoxically, lead to a new equilibrium. America and China may well arrive at a new modus vivendi, he suggests, a way to coexist even while competing intensely. It won't be easy. It won't happen quickly, but it's possible. The question is whether we get there through careful negotiation or through a series of increasingly painful escalations. As of this conversation, the world is watching to see if the United States and China can reach a trade agreement. One day, it seems imminent. The next day, talks appear to collapse. The uncertainty itself is economically damaging. We hope they reach some form of understanding, the Prime Minister says carefully. It doesn't have to be a comprehensive strategic agreement that solves everything. Even basic guardrails to manage the economic relationship would be better than nothing. Because the alternative, full decoupling, would be catastrophic not just for America and China, but for the entire global economy. If the US and China can find ways to coexist, then countries like Singapore and the rest of ASEAN can navigate this environment. We can maintain good relationships with both. But if they fully decouple, we're all forced to choose. And that's a choice we desperately want to avoid. This gets to the fundamental challenge facing nations across Asia, and indeed, the world. How do you maintain relations with two major powers that increasingly see themselves as adversaries? The China question. Rising or risen? Much of the Western discourse around China frames it as a rising power, implying it's still on the way up, still developing, still catching up to the West. But Singapore's Prime Minister has a different take. China is not just rising. In many crucial respects, it has already risen, he states bluntly. Yes, its per capita GDP is still only about 1/5 of America's, so there's enormous room for catch-up growth. But in certain sectors, advanced manufacturing, renewable energy, certain technologies, China isn't catching up. It's leading. This isn't cheerleading. It's an assessment based on economic reality. China produces more solar panels than the rest of the world combined. It dominates electric vehicle production. It's making breakthroughs in quantum computing and AI. The world needs to accept this reality, the Prime Minister continues. China will not converge with Western norms. It will chart its own path to modernity. And in some areas, it's gone beyond merely catching up. It's setting the pace. This reality makes some in the West deeply uncomfortable. It's one thing to engage with a China that's perpetually catching up and will eventually, presumably, adopt Western-style market democracy. It's quite another to engage with a China that's economically powerful, technologically advanced, and showing no signs of political liberalization. But uncomfortable or not, this is the China the world must deal with. Recent moves by Beijing suggest it's thinking seriously about its role in global leadership. It recently gave up special privileges at the World Trade Organization. It's doubling down on support for international institutions. These aren't the actions of a country that wants to tear down the global system. They're the actions of a country that wants a bigger say in how that system operates. We need to embrace the reality that China will be a key player, potentially a key leader, in whatever new global system emerges, the Prime Minister argues. The impossible choice. Singapore refuses to make. So this brings us to perhaps the most existentially important question for Singapore. Will you eventually have to choose between the United States and China? Singapore has spent decades cultivating close security ties with Washington while building deep economic relationships with Beijing. It's been the ultimate balancing act, maintaining American military access while becoming one of China's most important financial and logistics hubs. But many analysts believe this balancing act is becoming unsustainable, that eventually Singapore will be forced to pick a side. The Prime Minister doesn't accept this framing. Even with everything I've said about China's growing power, we're still talking about a country that cannot and will not replace America's role in the global system anytime soon, he explains. China is still a middle-income country with enormous domestic challenges. It's not at the same level as America. There is no new global leader emerging yet. This is the key insight. The problem isn't that China is ready to replace American leadership. The problem is that America seems less interested in leading while China isn't yet able to fill that void. We're in this messy transition period, and it could last for years, maybe more than a decade, the Prime Minister continues. During this time, we have to work with like-minded countries to preserve and strengthen the multilateral frameworks that still function. Building the future new frameworks for a new era. So what does this new multilateral system look like? Well, Singapore is actively building it, piece by piece. First, there's the effort to reform existing institutions. The World Trade Organization, for example, has been paralyzed by its consensus-based decision-making process. What was once a treasured principle ensuring all voices were heard has become a recipe for gridlock. We need to evolve, the Prime Minister argues. We need to allow smaller groups of countries to move forward with plurilateral agreements while keeping the door open for others to join later. This is diplomatic speak for we can't wait for everyone to agree anymore. Second, there are pathfinding initiatives, experimental new frameworks that could eventually be scaled up. One example is the Future of Investment and Trade Partnership, which brings together small and medium-sized trading nations, Singapore, UAE, and about a dozen others. These are all economies that depend heavily on trade and want to preserve a rules-based system, the Prime Minister explains. We're already virtually tariff-free among ourselves. The point isn't another traditional free trade agreement. It's about pioneering new approaches. What kind of new approaches? Standardizing regulations across borders, enabling electronic documentation and invoicing, facilitating data flows, making it easier for businesses to operate across multiple jurisdictions without drowning in paperwork. If we can demonstrate that these initiatives work, Perhaps they can eventually be multilateralized and adopted more broadly, he suggests. It's an incremental approach, building small networks that might one day connect into something larger. Not as glamorous as a grand global agreement, but perhaps more achievable. The investment question: is America still safe? Singapore's sovereign wealth funds are among the world's largest and most sophisticated investors. They have massive positions in American companies, American real estate, American infrastructure. So when the political environment in the United States becomes unpredictable, when the independence of the Federal Reserve is questioned, when economic policy changes seemingly on a whim, does that make Singapore reconsider? We're not scaling back investments in America right now, the Prime Minister states clearly. When we evaluate investments, yes, we look at macro-level risks, but we also look at individual company dynamics and growth prospects. And right now, while risk premiums at the macro level may have increased somewhat, we still see tremendous dynamism in American companies, particularly in technology.